Welcome to the AERA Writing Literacies SIG podcast, and this episode's theme is on multilingual literacies research and scholarship. In the spirit of community, the podcast team hopes this episode works to highlight important scholarship, push the literacies field, and mentor and cite others. Before we begin our discussion, we'll start with introductions. I'm April Camping from Arizona State University.
I'm Marcela Ossa Parra from Queens College.
I'm Renata Love Jones at Georgia State University.
And I'm Yalda Kaveh from Arizona State University.
All right, well, thank you everyone for being here for this conversation. The first question we wanted to talk about is, what are the main research questions you're each focused on right now? And what questions do you think are important for the field to address in studying multilingual literacies?
So in my case, my research questions that I'm focusing on now are related to curriculum design. In particular, how do we design curriculum that integrates students' ways of knowing and being and stimulates their literacy and language development. I'm also interested in understanding how my students and students in general, multilingual students, use diverse resources, multimodal resources to make meaning. These include not only their languages, but also gestures and different symbolic resources. And another aspect that I'm researching is how do teachers and students negotiate identities in translanguaging spaces?
In my case, my research looks primarily at pedagogies and curriculum that honor, sustain, extend the multilingual and multidialectal practices of children, especially within literacy classroom contexts. And I'm very interested in the ways that children come to deeply understand the literacy practices that they bring from home, as well as those that are connected to specific literacy tasks, maybe even content areas. How are they thinking about the language across those spaces? How are they thinking in nuanced ways about those cross-contextual connections that they're doing when they're switching from place to place? And that's not to say code switching, but we're talking about the intentional critical language awareness and metalinguistic awareness that is present in children, and that they continue to develop as they develop literacy across the lifespan. And so I'm really interested in what that looks like, what those conversations and what the play looks like, how teachers are facilitating that through the curriculum, as well as how they are facilitating those conversations and bridging those conversations just generatively. I'm also interested in the ways that children are conscious of bringing in literacies like those church literacies or literacies from their gaming into the schooling context, and what does that look like, and how do teachers honor that and not shut that down and really use it not only to leverage, but or leverage what students are doing in the classroom, but also to really encourage students to continue to build in those spaces.
And for me, I'm working on a few projects right now from a partnership I'm lucky to have with a local dual language school here in Arizona. And the school is a Title I urban school that enrolls predominantly Latinx, Black, Indigenous children. And the work that we're focusing on in general examines the different perspectives of different stakeholders in a dual language program, including children, parents, or caregivers, and the educational staff. Right now, one or two papers we're working on asks about the family engagement practices that supported by multilingual children's learning during the pandemic. So we collected data during the 2020-21 year And we observed that two exemplary kindergarten teachers use the opportunity of homeschooling or online schooling to reposition families as co-teachers, as they call them. And they brought in many of the cultural practices of families, including oral literacies, into their family engagement and their day-to-day practices. So as I said, we inquired about the children's perspective on that, the parents and the teachers. I also wanted to add that when I think about my work, I don't automatically situate it within the literacy field at large, but I want to give credit to our shared mentor, Dr. Patrick Proctor, who brought us together for an upcoming study group for LRA, and he made us remember, or made me remember, that multilingual literacy is beyond the dichotomy that we often think about as language and literacy separately. And actually that dichotomy that I have personally internalized makes us forget about the family literacy practices that are very important in the children's development of language and literacy. So I just wanted to share that in case there are others watching and listening who feel the same way, if their work concerns families and they don't consider it to be literacy. But as I've come to study this more deeply, I've come to understand that no, it does. And actually that's a very important part of literacy that has been historically ignored in our schools. And that is why we don't often think about it automatically.
I think that regarding the research questions that are important to the field, the work that Yalda and Renata are doing, for example, illustrate that important intersection between communities and schools that are so needed to stop thinking that families are not contributing to their students' education, to their children's education. When I when I work with my teachers in courses, sorry, I noticed a very deficit-based perspective on families. I think we have overcome the deficit perspective on students, but not on families. And there's this constant complaint about families not being engaged in their students' education because they don't have the resources. And this idea that families need training, need instruction. But so I feel that this research that centers families, communities is very important to take these deficit perspectives away from the families. So that's one area of research that I consider extremely relevant, as well as the areas of teacher preparation, because it's we have built important knowledge related to ensuring these strength-based approaches, but we need to work more with our student teachers to help them rethink how they teach, particularly because if they learned in a way that didn't honor their cultures and their languages and their fonts of knowledge, it's very difficult for them to enact a new kind of instruction. What I notice is that when they talk about it, they understand the theories, but then they design the lessons and they are the same lessons that they are used to learning. And then the other aspect that in my case I find very interesting is in bilingual education. How do we support language development at the same time that we engage our students in project-based learning, particularly when the students are having many opportunities to talk, but when they're building knowledge, they need to use the language that they are more familiar with and are stronger on. So I feel that it's difficult to promote this project-based learning and at the same time support their language development in a way that really, like, how do we have them have those authentic conversations in the new language or in the language that they're learning? That's another area that I feel is important and that many teachers wonder about, because by fifth grade, they are not using, let's say in Spanish, English bilingual programs, they're not using Spanish. They mostly use English because it's the language that the societal language and the language that they have the greatest command of.
I agree with Marcela 100%. And I think that when we as educators and educational researchers, when we don't take the time to ask families and children about what goes on in their home, including the literacy practices, then we make all these assumptions about, literacy practices in particular at home. Like, for instance, what Marcela was alluding to, like heritage language loss that happens in multilingual children. What I've noticed in service and pre-service teachers, sometimes they shy away from asking families like about their home language practices, or even about making recommendations that they should stick to their heritage language if they see appropriate. So they say that, oh, it's not my place to talk about it, but and I can understand that. But then when our language practices in our schools, especially monolingual schools, are so hegemonically in favor of English, then even when we are not discussing what happens at home, we are making implicit recommendations about that then inherently it impacts the language and literacy development of children and the family practices. Because in my work with families, I've noticed that children actually take the lead in shifting what happens at home. So a lot of times multilingual families and parents, they want to have bilingual children, they want to raise their children bilingually, but as their children start to push back on that and use more and more English, then they kind of take a step back. So just goes to show how important it is for educators and families to be in conversation about their shared and common goals, or sometimes if their goals are not shared, then they should discuss that as well. And the last thing I'll say to that in terms of like what the field should think about is to take more steps to hear from the children. A lot of times we think that children don't have a lot to say, or some topics are too advanced for the children. But in my current research with kindergarteners, of course the nature of interviews are different with them, but their perspectives are so valuable and important to hear from, because they are the ones who are sitting in our classrooms. So I feel really strongly that the field at large should do more about hearing from children and also parents and caregivers.
I think in one way, the ways that I see the questions that I'm asking really pressing towards equity concerns is really thinking about the opportunities within curriculum, within classroom practice for children to see themselves, to have their language, their knowledges, their joys, their ways of being, their emerging insights, their playful inquiries really amplified, for teachers to be conscious in making that space, regardless of what the curriculum is in front of them sometimes, but also for the teachers to be invested in moving the students through this really strong autonomous thinking that honors whatever literacies they're bringing from whatever space into each and every classroom moment, so that when the children go out into a world that sometimes tells some of us that, our literacies, our knowledges, our ways of speaking are not appropriate or correct or whatever, that the children themselves can then push back and say, nope, wait, that's not what I learned. That's not what I've come to understand about myself and my community. And for the teachers and the schools, the districts, for them to really be part of that journey of making this possible. I remember like when early on, Marcela, Yalda, and I were working on a curriculum together, and there were a lot of questions that came up about even how we present definitions. Do we just tell the children what the definition is, or do we ask them how they become familiar with it? How have you used this? How have you seen this? Is there anything that it makes you think of when you see this? Even those small spaces like that has the opportunity for students to bring in their community and familial knowledges about language. And for them to feel, as they rightly should, that they are the experts on themselves and their literacy, and they're going to continue to develop those expertise and deeper insights there. And so I think, part of that is in these questions, I've also thought about what are the books that they get to see their language practices modeled, their literacies knowledge are modeled, and their knowledge modeled. What are the videos that do that? What are the questions that we're asking them to ponder that, is really expressivist, and not just, this is what the teacher thinks and this is where the student needs to get, but this is how the student has come to engage the material and what is important to them. And so I think all of these things and how children come to do this work and how students are given room to do this and encouraged to do this, and the practice continues to maintain over time is a big part of how I'm bringing equity into this.
I think that brings us to a really good piece of the next question the podcast team wanted to ask about, in terms of ways that you center different voices of the people involved in your work and in your research. And when you're talking about having the kids be experts, because they are the experts on themselves and their experiences. Can you talk about other ways that you center student, teacher, family, and community voices in your research?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, my current work focuses on, the perspectives of all stakeholders in a dual language program, including the children, parents, and caregivers, and the educational staff. And I want to emphasize that most of the families in this community are from BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, communities of color backgrounds. So the ways method-wise I have centered, well, question-wise and method-wise, I have centered these communities is that, well, first of all, I ask in my research questions, what do the children think about their educational experiences in this program? What do parents and caregivers think? And then method-wise, we have been doing critical ethnographic work with this community. And in the past year, we had to get really creative about how we could gather data. And for centering the students, I want to talk about that first. There were a few ways that I wanted to hear from the children. One was just through classroom observations, rather than just focusing on what the teacher is doing. We were paying close attention to how the kids were responding to the teachers and how they were interacting with each other. Mind you that these kindergartners, it was their first experience with school and with their peers, and they were meeting each other online. And there was this one particular conversation during break where the children were asking each other, do you live in Arizona? And then one of them said, yes. And the other said, I live in the United States. And it was just so neat to just capture that and hear how they interacted with each other in this very unique circumstances. And we also conducted interviews with these kindergartners, and knowing that there are different age group that I was used to, I mostly had worked with upper elementary children. So we had to get really creative. And one of our former colleagues, Chris Wagner, he did his dissertation with, literacy with kindergartners or first graders. And his work really helped me think more about how to situate the interview. So we did a read aloud with a couple books that centered the children's cultural and linguistic identities. I want to emphasize the plural here. And then we had a group conversation about the book and how they related to the characters. And then afterwards, we followed up with the interview, the read aloud conversation with interviews. And our third step, which we didn't get to do given all the changes that went on, was to do portraits with the children of their bilingual, biliterate, or multiliterate identity. So there are many ways we could center, children and families in our research. It may just take a few more steps than what we are used to. It doesn't mean it's more difficult. It's actually, in my experience, more fun. And then last comment I'll make is that with families too, I've mostly done interviews with families, parents, and caregivers. And yeah, so that's how I try to center my work around children and families. It's a passion of mine, and I actually really enjoy it, as I say, much more than just doing research focused on the teacher. So I like to combine all three, and that makes it more cohesive and fun for me.
With my work, the ways that I've gone about attempting to center student, teacher, family, and community voice. First, within the classroom practice is really disrupting a particular expectation of what students are doing. And so not looking for the right answer, but what is the sense-making answer? What is the negotiation of meaning that allows me to just be curious about how students are playing around with things. I found that to be really helpful in disrupting what is natural in most of us teachers, wanting people to get to a particular place, a particular endpoint, and to really start to think about learning as a journey. I think doing the same thing with teachers is even more powerful, because a lot of times it's easy to sit and look at one's data, to look at an observation and to think about how a teacher, oh, like that teacher did that how I expected, or that was amazing, to, really think about what does teacher learning look like in this space, because we've all gone through school systems that have historically privileged a certain type of learning, a certain organizational hierarchy in classes. And so I think that has been both a challenge and a space of growth and learning in my own work, to make sure that that while I'm really making this effort to center students' voices and experience in the classroom, that I'm also doing the same to kind of listen to where teachers, what is driving them? What is their biggest priority when they come into to a particular activity in the classroom? And then also, how do they make sense of it afterwards? How do they continue to make sense of it over and across multiple activities as the curriculum continues to progress over the course of the year? Recently, I've been working with some colleagues here at Georgia State, and we've been talking to teachers, parents, and administrators about how they are attempting to support their children during what has been a really kind of rough year in a lot of different ways, not just because it was distance learning, not just because it was a pandemic, not just because, every day we were experiencing this real gaslighting and flood of from the news. And so asking all of them how they're making sense of it, and doing check-ins across the year has been this really important opportunity to have people's voices and narratives heard as they navigate, as they negotiate. I think some of the methods that I would encourage others to use, some things that I found really powerful are using the cultural historical activity theory to really make sense of the tools that people are using, the goals, implicit and explicit, the rules that are guiding people's logic as they navigate and try to move across whatever goal that they're attempting to reach. as well as those distributions of labor in this space and how they're making sense of it. As we continue to engage that data, it's been really interesting to hear how teachers are making sense of the ways that the classroom space changed because of the virtual world, and how they were able to really take advantage of particular tools and distributions of labor, and have particular goals. And so I think no matter the space or context, that has been a really important methodology for me to utilize to really unpack like the myriad of factors that are going into the ways that educators or even parents and administrators take up learning with their child. It is my hope that pretty soon that we'll have an IRB out that will allow us to ask more of the children, because I think they've been doing some fun things with their literacies, whether they've been playing online with their friends or finding new ways to engage with each other. I think there's some real opportunities to hear more about how they themselves have made sense of the year and seen their learning shift or change in the year. And so I'm really excited about that. And I think that that methodology is going to be really helpful.
In terms of my work, I center student, teacher, family, and community voices through an approach to designing curriculum that is focused on the students and on their thinking and making meaning and doing projects that are meaningful to them and engage their families. I do action research to understand the development of this curriculum, how the students are engaging with it, how can I modify it. I pay close attention to the ways in which I also, it's easy to, again, as it happens with my students, it happens also to me, that we have deep understandings of the theory, but when we act, the theories, many times they are not so according to what we had envisioned, because we have also internalized ideologies and ways of thinking, as Renata was mentioning, that need to be unpacked. So I do critical analysis of not only, since I am trying out these lessons myself about my teaching and how this can illuminate the understanding of how ideologies seep into these spaces that are supposed to be culturally sustaining. I also focus on my students' thinking. So like thinking in terms of enacted thinking, situated thinking. So my work is very student-centered in that sense. I am bringing in their ideas and doing fine-grained analysis of their thinking through their language use, their use of different meaning-making tools to understand what is going on. So that's another way in which I center their voices, to also understand the teaching process and in terms of how they responded to that teaching process. So right now I'm focused on action research, but other methods that I would like to explore and that I recommend would be useful for researchers to do to center students, families, communities' voices, are a participatory action research that would enable a deeper community engagement or deeper engagement, student engagement in deciding what they want to learn. A photo voice is an interesting approach, and thinking about other visual approaches that would bring other modalities, and in that way we could center other ways of making meaning that go beyond the traditional texts. So those would be other approaches to research that I recommend and that I'm interested in trying out in the future.
So in thinking about these spaces where you're doing this work and the methods you're using and the voices you're trying to center, there's a lot to manage. And I know for emerging scholars and researchers, you know, and researchers and scholars who have been doing this work for a long time, there are a lot of challenges that we face. So a question we've discussed on Twitter chats and questions that the podcast team has received or thought about center a little bit on these challenges and describing them and making them clear and known for others can be helpful when we work to address them. So a third question we had for you was, what challenges have you encountered in your work? And you've already kind of addressed some of that, but what did you do in response? And what advice do you have for other researchers and other scholars who are facing these challenges?
Thank you, April. So I think one of the challenges that I've had, one of my mentors from undergrad, the beautiful pastoral counselor who also did a lot of work in Afrocentric knowledge and learning and spent a lot of time in Ghana. And she used to always tell me, everything is everything, everything is everything. And I think I embraced that a little bit too much. It's definitely been both the beauty and the challenge of the work that I do, trying to understand and hold all the things while finding what is the one question that I can answer in this paper or for this moment or that matters. And it doesn't mean that I can't go back to the other directions, to the other thoughts that emerged in the midst of it, but really, you know, again, how do I pause and say, okay, like I know that I'm interested in children's practices and perspectives and their meta-linguistic engagement. I know that I'm interested in homes and communities and their desire for their children and their youth. I know that I'm interested in schools and districts and teachers' practice. And I know that I'm interested in the curriculum, but I cannot, that was really long, right? And so how does one find what is most essential and important for the moment? The thing that needs to be shared, the thing that needs to be heard and played with and understood and built on. How does one locate that and say, this is what I'm going to do right now? And it's okay. It's okay. I don't have to do the whole chicken dill meal at once. That has been, I think, one of my greatest challenges. And I think, you know, being able to talk it out with colleagues and peers, being able to write out, okay, here are all the different directions that this data is suggesting, but this is what I'm going to run with right now, and having some peer engagement with that. I think the other thing is, again, if I'm centering students and centering communities and centering teachers, I have to ask them what they're most interested in. Like what is pressing to them? What are they like, oh, like I really want to understand this better, or I really want this to look and feel better when I'm engaging it. And so really also, you know, sometimes putting my own, like, this is what I would do right now, aside a little bit, and being able to work in collaboration and partnership so that the needs of those that I'm working with are actually getting met, because that's part of the reason why we came in to do this to begin with, so that people can have better schooling and educational experiences so that their literacies can be heard. And so, yeah, I think that's part of how I've wrestled with that. Like, what do I do? There's so much. Really pausing.
In my case, there are many challenges. I think that the love of this work is what keeps me going, but it's been challenging. So my first challenge that came to my mind has to do with something that is external and that is out of my control. And it is the funding for work that does not focus on outcome measures. So it's very difficult to find funding for the work that we do. So because like large funds, you can get small funds, but if you want, like, I think that to do research in this area, you need to convince yourself that you're going to do small studies. Large scale studies are difficult, or you would need to be really creative about designing some outcome measures, but those are totally, like, it's difficult to align. And yes, Renata is telling, for example, the IES, the Institute of Education Sciences, only funds studies that have outcome measures. They also have established some areas of priority for funding that do not include Spanish. They include other languages, but not Spanish, which is very discouraging because still the population, the biggest population that speaks another language in the United States is Spanish. But since I guess there is enough research or there are enough resources for the IES, their area of focus right now are other languages. So again, you have to learn how to frame your research in such way that is not only focused on Spanish. That Renata and I have been working on some ways of doing this. But so that is one aspect that has been, that I envision as being challenging in the future. Right now, I am focused on building my research agenda, and I don't feel ready to apply for one of these grants. And I wonder if I will ever apply, because perhaps their philosophy does not fit with mine. And in that sense, that just keeps me away from doing these large studies that are very valued in the education field. So it's like choosing the most difficult path. We are not the only ones. There are many people who have led the way and have shown us that it's possible to do it, given us the example, but we are choosing a difficult and different path. And then another aspect that I've found challenging in the city where I work in New York City is getting access to schools. So the DOE has created a fortress. The IRB is very difficult to navigate. And the studies that they allow are very limited. So, and they have a vision like of experimental research. And do not have the research. So that's been also, like, navigating these external things have been difficult. And it's sad because the principals are interested in the work, but the DOE has established very strict requirements that make access to schools almost impossible. For example, during the pandemic, no access to schools unless the research was related to the pandemic, strictly related to the pandemic. Offering extra instruction, that was not the pandemic. So that didn't fit as related to the pandemic. And regarding myself as a researcher, as a bilingual woman, Colombian, it's very difficult to find a space, produce in the level that I have internalized that I should produce. I'm not sure. I don't think that's the level that my college wants me to produce, but it's something that I feel some kind of pressure to, that you need to do this. And it's not easy, and that is always in my mind, particularly also if you have kids and life, everyone has life that makes it very difficult. So the production is complicated, and I feel that there is this disconnect between producing quality work and producing quantities of work. And many times we find ourselves trying to cut a paper in the fewest pieces in order to produce more papers, or we find ourselves trying to take on more research or more activities than we can in order to produce, but many times forgetting about the quality and the real contributions that we're making to the field. So I think that has been something that I didn't envision when I took this job or when I chose this profession, that have been extremely challenging in the present. And I hope to really learn to not use others as my criteria, as my meter, just use myself as my meter, and to really understand what I'm trying to contribute and not focus on quantity, but quality. But doing this reflection, internalizing it, and forgetting about all the other outside expectations is it's a path that takes long to go through it. So yes, those would be, in summary, the three challenges the most relevant or most pressing challenges that I faced during the past 3 years.
Can I just say, I love our discussion on this question very much. And that just goes to show that in academic spaces, maybe we should talk more about the challenges. I think we don't go to many conferences where researchers, like when they lay out methodologies, they also discuss challenges. And I think for emerging scholars, when you are the recipient and the audience of somebody who's got it all figured out, then you think that I can't possibly do that. But I think that's because people, show their best image in those spaces. But I think it's very important for us to hear about the challenges. And I'm lucky that with my sister scholars here, we are often in conversation about some of the challenges they mentioned. As they said, the funding for qualitative ethnographic work, sadly, is not supported by large grants that much. You're always pushed to mix in some of the quantitative aspects, which then when it's not true to you, it comes through to the funders as well. So I guess one solution I would add to that would be to partner up with somebody who's good at that. So that way you are not faking something that you're not interested in or good at. You are partnering with somebody, and then through the process maybe you will learn more about those methodologies. And then IRB, as Marcela said, I know she has had many challenges. Thankfully here I had better luck, but I want to emphasize that when we are emerging scholars, we are often, we take jobs that are different from the context we went to grad school or we lived. So the context of the state, the city are very new to us. So it takes time to build relationships, to meet people in the schools, in the districts, in DOE. So give yourself that grace period. And one tip I have for those who are doing their doctoral dissertation study is to collect a lot of data now that you have the opportunity. So while you're trying to figure out your postdoctoral research, you have data from your dissertation to work on and generate, publications and meet your institutional criteria while you're trying to take your time and figure out new avenues for your research. Now with research with multiple stakeholders, like my sisters, I've faced many challenges. One is that it takes time to build trust with schools. So give yourself time to build that trust. Don't, approach schools with this pre-figured out, agenda that I want to come here and I want to research you and your community. As Renata mentioned, be open to what they are interested in. Maybe approach them and say, here are some areas I'm interested in exploring, but I want to meet with you and your staff to hear what questions you are interested in. In my case, actually, it took me a year and a half to just hang out with the school and with the teachers because we were figuring out our IRB, but that really worked to our advantage because we built that trust before we turned on the mic and we said, let's roll the recording. So I really encourage you to think about that. I know we are facing pressures to produce, as my sisters mentioned, but figure out a way to always have. I know Marcela and I talked about how you should always have like this 3-step process. You have your data that you're focusing on, then you are collecting data, and maybe you're thinking about future projects. So I know that's a lot, but I think that's what it takes to do if you don't want to like rush things. You always have to have that process brewing. And so with the methods themselves, with the challenge of those, I mentioned trust with the community, but then working with parents is challenging because they are busy, especially if you work with marginalized families. Sometimes they have, more than one job that they have to work at. They're not sometimes comfortable with meeting with you at the school. Bear in mind that school can be a threatening space for some of our marginalized families. So we should be very open in terms of time, space, methods when we work with marginalized communities. Obviously, be cognizant of linguistic barriers that we create for families. And sometimes we just think about, English, Spanish, but there are other ways, like the English varieties. The way we talk in our academic institutions is not always accessible to all of our families. So be respectful of that when you conduct the interviews. So that's been a challenge. I've even become cognizant of how I dress when I go to the school, how I'm positioning myself, because I'm an outsider and I know that, but how do you like tone it down a little? And then the last thing I'll say is the challenge of working with the children. As I mentioned before, it's extremely important to take the time and work with children and hear from them, but it has its own challenges. They don't respond to interview questions the same way we do with adults. So one thing I was reminded as the conversation went on, for example, like Renata was saying, sometimes we have our theories and methods and we're not open to changing them. But when we were designing our interview methods for the children, we spent hours developing what we thought was this child-friendly Likert scale of emojis to show to the kids how they feel when they use Spanish and English or their other heritage languages. And then we were doing these interviews over Zoom, and I pulled up the Likert scale of emojis and I said, well, can you point or tell me how you feel when you use your language? And then the kid tells me that, well, that Zoom has a reaction, function. We can just use that. I was like, brilliant. Like, me and my team of doctoral students never thought about that. That this, 5-year-old, she said, there's this Zoom reaction that we could use is much easier. And that's just a brilliant reminder of how, no matter how we think, how much we think we know with our fancy degrees and education, there is valuable knowledge in the communities that sometimes, unfortunately, we think the least of. So I want to close it at that, my answer on this question. So there are challenges, but there are also beauties hidden in those communities. So be open, I would say. Don't go in with your agenda, be open to change.
Wow, thank you all so much for these responses. I feel like that's a really great piece, a great way to close this conversation, but I also feel like a part 2 and a part 3 and a part 4 would be great to have. But we'll end this here. And again, I wanted to thank all of you for being willing to participate today and for raising all these important topics and addressing these questions that the research and scholarship community has in terms of multilingual literacies. So thank you once again, and hopefully we can continue the conversation soon.